8 years ago, conservationists did what many called impossible. They released 1,000 European bison into Romania's abandoned communist farmland, hoping to revive a vanished wilderness. Most predicted slow change, if any. But now, satellites have exposed a transformation so dramatic, it's visible from space. This isn't just an animal comeback. It's the largest wild bison rewilding in European history. How did a landscape left empty for centuries become Europe's boldest ecological experiment? The answer begins with loss, hope, and a radical vision for the forgotten Carpathians. Long before satellites tracked the return of wild herds, the Carpathians fell silent. European bison, once the kings of these forests, were hunted out of Romania by the end of the 18th century. The last native bison here was killed in the 1790s, vanishing into memory as fields and valleys emptied of their largest animal. Across the continent, the story was the same. By 1927, the very last wild European bison was shot in the Caucasus. Only 54 survived, scattered in zoos, their bloodlines narrowed by centuries of pursuit and shrinking forests. The land itself changed just as quickly. Under communist rule, Romania's valleys were carved into vast collective farms. Ancient woods fell to axes and tractors, replaced by endless rows of wheat and maize. Villages filled with workers, livestock, the machinery of state agriculture. But when the regime collapsed in 1989, the system that kept these fields alive collapsed with it. The megafauna were gone. The people, too. In 2011, a handful of conservationists and local leaders gathered around a simple idea. What if the emptiest corner of Romania could become Europe's wildest? The southern Carpathians, especially the Tarcu Mountains, offered something rare. Tens of thousands of hectares where nature had already started to take back abandoned fields and forests. No fences, no intensive farming, just a patchwork of grassland, woodland, and old river valleys stretching as far as the eye could see. For a project this ambitious, that kind of space wasn't just useful, it was essential. Bison need room to roam, to migrate, to shape the land in ways that smaller reserves couldn't allow. The Tarcu site had more than just the right geography. Its legal status as a Natura 2000 protected area meant conservation was already written into local plans. Land tenure was unusually straightforward thanks to depopulation and the collapse of collective farms. Instead of fighting over crowded fields, project planners found a landscape where almost nobody objected to making room for wildlife. Local councils, land associations, and even skeptical villagers saw a glimmer of economic hope in the promise of tourism and new jobs. That mix, vast connected wildlands and a community with little left to lose, tipped the scales. As Alexandra Saleh-Mosoy, one of the project managers, put it, "We work with over 16 breeding centers and reservations in Europe, each bison genetically valuable and carefully chosen for the optimal habitat in Tarcu." Early feasibility studies mapped out forage, water, and shelter, confirming that the area could support a free-roaming herd, not just a fenced showpiece. The vision was clear: let bison move as they once did, and let the land recover on their terms. By the end of 2013, the plan was set. The southern Carpathians would become the stage for Europe's largest wild bison comeback. All that remained was to bring the animals home. In May 2014, a convoy of livestock trucks wound its way into the heart of the southern Carpathians. Each vehicle carried precious cargo, European bison, sourced from breeding centers in Germany, Poland, and Sweden. The journey was anything but routine. Every border crossing meant another round of paperwork, veterinary checks, and anxious waiting. Permits for moving a critically endangered species across Europe weren't just a formality. They were a gauntlet. Drivers and veterinarians took turns sleeping in the cabs, always alert for signs of stress among the animals. They checked temperatures, heart rates, and hydration at every stop, knowing that a single misstep could cost a life. The bison themselves were silent passengers, their crates lined with straw, hay, and the scent of unfamiliar lands. For some, this was the first time out of captivity. For all, it was the start of a journey that would end in a place no bison had roamed wild for over 2 centuries. The convoy crept through the final mountain roads at dawn. Local volunteers, conservationists, and a small veterinary crew stood ready at a hastily built acclimatization enclosure near Armenish. The air was thick with tension. Years of planning, months of negotiation, and hundreds of kilometers on the road had come down to this moment. Before the gates opened, each animal was checked one last time. Health protocols demanded blood samples, visual inspections, and a review of every shipping document. Only then did the team unlock the crates. One by one, 20 bison stepped onto Romanian soil, blinking into the sunlight, muscles tense, nostrils flaring at the strange mix of grass and mountain air. No fences or crowds, just a quiet, open pen where they could recover from the ordeal. This was the soft release, a buffer zone between captivity and the wild, designed to let the bison acclimate, regain strength, and settle into the rhythms of a new landscape. For the veterinary crew, the relief was almost physical. Weeks of sleepless nights gave way to a cautious optimism as the bison began to graze, explore, and, slowly, relax. GPS collars were fitted for tracking, and a round-the-clock watch began. The first wild bison in Romania since the 1790s stood on their own, watched over by a handful of exhausted but hopeful people. The experiment was finally real. All that remained was to see what the animals would do and whether the land would answer. The first true test came quietly, in the early mornings and late evenings when rangers began spotting tiny hoofprints beside the big ones. By the spring of 2017, calves were being born on the open range. Bison calves, wild and unmarked, the first in these mountains since the age of Napoleon. The birth of each calf was a minor miracle, proof that the animals were not just surviving, but settling in, finding enough forage, evading predators, and forming real herds. Rangers tracked the new arrivals with a mix of science and superstition, counting calves at dawn, watching for signs of illness, and sometimes just listening for the low, throaty grunts of mothers hidden in the grass. Matei Miculescu, a local who once doubted the project, now spent his days in the field. He knew every twist of the forest trails, every clearing where bison rested, every muddy wallow stamped with fresh tracks. His job had changed everything for his family. Instead of leaving for work abroad, he became a bison ranger, part wildlife tracker, part guide, part ambassador to curious tourists. He carried a battered notebook, logging calf sightings and herd movements, and a phone full of photos. Calves with their mothers, yearlings sparring, bulls rubbing their horns on saplings. The herd was growing. 20 animals became 40, then 60, then over 100 by 2022. Each new calf was a small rebellion against history, a living answer to centuries of silence. Monitoring the births wasn't just about numbers. Calves meant the land itself was working again, enough grass, water, and shelter to support a new generation. Local employment followed the herds. Young people trained as rangers, guides, and wildlife monitors. Guest houses reopened, offering hot meals and bison stories to visitors who came from across Europe to catch a glimpse of the wild herds. The herds themselves began to shape the land, grazing in patterns that created open meadows, keeping forests from closing in, and scattering seeds with every step. By the end of the 8th year, the bison were no longer a fragile experiment. They were a presence. Over 100 strong, roaming an area the size of a small city. Their movements tracked by satellites, their calves counted by the people who once wondered if any of this would work at all. 8 years after the first bison set hoof on abandoned farmland, a team of ecologists sat in front of a wall of satellite images. The data didn't just show a few scattered herds. It revealed something nobody had predicted. The land itself had changed, and the change was visible from space. Where once there were monotonous fields, now the imagery showed a patchwork, a living mosaic of grassland, scrub, and open forest, stitched together in irregular shapes and shifting colors. The uniform green of old farmland had fractured into dozens of shades, each one marking a different stage of regrowth or grazing. Some patches glowed with the short, vivid green of heavily grazed grass. Others blurred into the deep gold of tall forbs or the shadowy edge of young trees pushing back against the open. The numbers were hard to believe. Landscape heterogeneity, scientists' term for the variety and complexity of plant cover, had spiked far beyond what passive abandonment alone could explain. In just 8 years, the bison had created a landscape as varied as a natural floodplain, but with their own signature. Dr. Andrei Popescu, one of the remote sensing specialists on the project, described the moment the team realized what they were seeing. "We ran the code 3 times to check for errors. The difference between 2014 and 2022 was so obvious, we thought the files were mislabeled. But every validation, field surveys, drone flights, GPS tracks, confirmed it. The bison had turned abandoned farmland into a living mosaic. No fertilizer, no planting, no heavy machinery, just wild grazers, moving and feeding as they pleased. And the proof was not just in the grass underfoot, but in the pixels of every satellite pass, stretching across nearly 90 square kilometers. The southern Carpathians had become a case study in how quickly a landscape can change when given back its largest architects. Bison are not just wanderers, they are architects. Each day, their choices ripple outward, shaping the land in ways no machine or mower ever could. Grazing is their main tool. When a herd moves through a field, they clip the grass low and leave patches untouched. This uneven feeding keeps some areas open, while others grow tall, creating a patchwork of heights and textures. Where bison linger, the sward stays short and sun-loving wildflowers appear. Where they pass by, shrubs and young trees get a head start, pushing the mosaic in a different direction. Then come the wallows, shallow pits the animals carve out by rolling in the dust or mud. These hollows fill with rainwater, turning into temporary ponds just deep enough for frogs and salamanders to breed. Bark stripping is another trick. When bison rub their horns or gnaw at young trees, they create deadwood, opening homes for beetles, fungi, and birds like woodpeckers. Every trampling hoof presses seeds into the soil, scuffs bare patches for new plants, and carves trails that other animals follow. Even their dung matters. It's rich in nutrients, drawing in dung beetles and fertilizing the ground in tight, concentrated bursts. Ecologists tracking these changes have watched insect numbers climb in grazed meadows, with butterflies and beetles thriving in the new variety of plants. Birds follow, from storks hunting in open grass to warblers nesting in the scrub. Amphibians find new pools and rare orchids take hold in undisturbed soil. It's a chain reaction, set in motion by the simple daily habits of a herd. Proof that sometimes, the best way to heal a landscape is to give its oldest engineers room to work. In Armenis, Armenish, the sound of bison hooves has become the heartbeat of a new local economy. Guest houses once shuttered now buzz with visitors eager for a glimpse of wild herds. Every year, thousands book wildlife tours, fill up cabins, and buy meals from families who once wondered if their village had a future at all. The job titles have changed: ranger, guide, wildlife monitor, each one rooted in the rhythms of the land. Mate Miculescu, who once considered leaving for work abroad, now spends his days tracking bison and leading tourists through the foothills. His story isn't unique. Dozens of locals have found steady work, from guiding to hosting, and even selling handmade crafts inspired by the animals. Schools have woven bison into their lessons, turning the return of these giants into a point of pride for the next generation. Children draw bison on classroom walls, and field trips double as wildlife surveys. The phrase "bison country" now appears on signs and souvenirs, a badge of identity as much as a marketing pitch. For many, the animals are more than a curiosity. They're a reason to stay, a source of income, and a living symbol of what the community can achieve together. Scaling up from 100 bison to 1,000 is not just a numbers game. It's a test of how wild we're willing to let the future become. Policy strategist Ioan Dragoi describes it as a balancing act, with every step forward weighed against risk. The goal is 500 bison by the year 2030, but each addition must be carefully chosen. Genetic diversity is guarded like a bank vault. Every animal is tracked, and new bloodlines are brought in to avoid the old bottlenecks that nearly wiped the species out a century ago. Disease is a constant shadow. Tuberculosis surveillance never stops, and any hint of infection triggers immediate field checks. Wolves and bears are part of the picture now too. In 2019, a GPS-collared calf fell to wolves, sparking a flurry of debate about whether to intervene or let nature decide. For farmers, the risks are more personal. A bison in the wrong field can flatten a season's crops overnight. Compensation schemes are under review, but some landowners are still waiting for payouts. Dragoya and his team see this as a live experiment in coexistence, one that could be repeated anywhere abandoned land waits for a second chance, if the lessons and the limits are taken seriously. In just 8 years, satellite data confirmed a measurable increase in landscape diversity across the southern Carpathians, directly linked to the return of over 100 free-roaming European bison since 2014. This project turned abandoned farmland into a mosaic of grassland, forest edge, and wetland habitats. Outcomes documented in remote sensing records and ecological surveys. Local communities witnessed new economic opportunities, while wild-born bison marked a first for Romania in 2 centuries. Yet key questions remain. Can the herd reach 1,000 and sustain itself without constant management? How will bison coexist with farmers and predators as numbers rise? What happens as climate pressures intensify? The evidence is clear. Targeted rewilding can transform both land and livelihoods faster than predicted. The southern Carpathians now stand as living proof that, with the right conditions, lost megafauna can engineer recovery on a scale visible from space.